Students Commission. And just to give you an overview of what we're looking at today, I'll go through some introductions. May as well start that now. My name's Martin. I'm Deputy Director of NEOM. We're delighted to be joined by Jeff Layer, who, as many of you will know, is the chair of the Disabled Students Commission. Jeff's had a long, can I use that word, Jeff? Long and varied career. Graduating in law in 1977, he taught at Sheffield Hallam between 1983 and 1999 before moving to Bradford, where he was made Deputy Vice Chancellor Academic, and then was seconded to HEFCE. And for those of you who aren't old enough to remember HEFCE, HEFCE was the Higher Education Funding Council for England, which later morphed into the OFS. And Jeff helped develop their widening participation approach and indeed Aim Higher, for some of those who remember that. And I am in fact using some Aim Higher Nottinghamshire paper, which I acquired over my career. Jeff then moved in 2011 to become Vice Chancellor of Wolverhampton University, and recently retired. Obviously took early retirement, as you can tell. So it's a great privilege to have Jeff here, and he's going to be talking to us about the Disabled Students Commitment and why we all need to get behind this, but more importantly, he wants to try and get our views about how the commitment can work, and whether we have any comments about it, and anything we want to add. So it's a pleasure to welcome you all here. After Jeff's spoken and given us an overview about everything, we'll then hopefully have a discussion. If you've got any questions for Jeff while he's presenting, please type them in the chats and we can come to them at the end of his presentation. So without further ado, Jeff, I shall hand over to yourself.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you to everybody who's in this call today, and thank you for taking the time. The bit you didn't mention, Martin, and thank you for those kind words, was that my first class was our first class I taught was in 1978 for the WEA at Concert Steelworks, to a group of trade union officials, and shortly after they closed Concert Steelworks, and I'm never quite sure whether it was anything to do with my class or what, but so it's a long I've been teaching for a long time, and what I wanted to talk about today is very much the Disabled Student Commitment and what we're seeking to do, and to really welcome comments and contributions from colleagues, because it's we've titled this Going Forward and No Going Back, and there's a reason for that. And we've got a set of slides here which we will go through, but I tend to talk a bit more broadly to start with, which is, you know, the whole, and then there'll be a lot of people in the room who've got really significant practical experience, and will have done some great work. But one of the things that the Disabled Student Commitment is saying is that institutions need to have a much more strategic and holistic approach around the support of disabled students. And we'll say more about that in a minute. So if we can have the next slide, please, Martin, which just tells people about the Disabled Students Commission. I was appointed as the first chair of the Disabled Students Commission, and that was a 3-year appointment. It's coming to the end of that period. In that 3 years, I've reported to 6 different universities' ministers, and none of them stayed around particularly long. So we've had a lot of change, but you can see there that we've got lay commissioners, people giving their own time to develop the work of the commission. A couple of disabled students are in there. whilst OFS gives a small amount of funding, the key thing to remember is that we are totally independent as a Disabled Students Commission. We don't accept any brief from any organisation. We are independent, and our focus is disabled students. Can the next slide, please, ma'am? We were established 1 week before the first lockdown. You know, and we got going, and obviously a lot of things changed over what we anticipated. We did a lot of work on thinking through the issues for disabled students during those really, really difficult periods of where you don't even know if admissions is going to happen, clearing is going to happen, or when it's going to happen, and what you're going to do with open days, and how we're going to look after disabled students during the scenario where none of us really knew what was happening from 1 week to another. Martin told you that I was the Vice Chancellor of Wolverhampton during that period. I quite categorically say that, you know, we didn't know what would be happening from 1 week to another, because we were in the same position as everybody else in terms of knowledge. Everybody tried to do the best they could in very difficult circumstances. But we explored what the impact of COVID was on the disabled student experience. We did a lot of questions, a lot of surveys, a lot of round tables, listened very clearly to the disabled student voice and to a lot of practitioners. Go to the next slide, please, Martin. And we found that students wanted 4 things, basically. And I'll say a little bit about those in terms of examples. They wanted certainty. They want to know what's going to happen when, and that it's going to happen. They want to know that if their class is rearranged, that their support worker is going to know that it's been rearranged, and that if it's been moved to somewhere that's accessible, that it's got to be accessible. So they want certainty. They need to know. We talk, as you all know, disabled students are sort of the most vulnerable students we have. And it's important that we make sure that they're given the opportunity to excel. Second issue they wanted was communication. Talk to us, tell us what's happening. Don't leave us in the dark. Be clear with us. Consistency. Yeah, we found that there's elements of inconsistency. And you got scenarios, and you could see this happening, where academics suddenly move into online in the first instance, and then blended learning, doing the best they could, wanted to make their classes as exciting and as interesting as possible, might actually change learning platforms in the middle of a class, throwing completely a range of students with particular conditions, and not realizing, not understanding what they were doing. And then the issue of choice, very important one. Let's let students take views and decide what they want to do and how they want to do it. Classic on that is assessment. You know, let's give students options of how to be assessed. Let them choose the one that's best for them, rather than imposing a strict regime on all students. So move to the next slide, Martin, please. What do we find? We you know, none of this it will be particularly new to colleagues. That the a significant number of disabled students look at what support is available before they go to university. But it's still, you know, it's a significant percentage. But you know, why aren't they all? Why aren't we all doing that? More and more people are sharing information around disability. DSA take-up is increasing year on year. But a lot of the take-up, a lot of the increase is in mental health conditions. And that's seen a significant increase. And I suspect we will see an even bigger increase as the pandemic, impact of the pandemic. Attainment rates for students, disabled students, is a bit lower than it is for other students. The gap is narrowing. It's nowhere near the chasm it is for on race, but it is slightly down. You've got more issues around discrimination, unfortunately. And you've got issues around employment, as they're far less likely to be in particular types of employment than other students. And you know, that's despite the best efforts of a lot of HE providers, that isn't necessarily their responsibility and their agenda, but they can help influence things, and that's quite crucial. Just move on to the next slide, Martin, please. So we thought, well, let's have a look at this in the sense of the disabled student experience, the student life cycle. And we said, well, there's a number of things that are really important. Participation, access by disabled students is just below sort of sector average. It's better in some areas than others. It's better by certain conditions than others. There's clearly multiple conditions issues. There's clearly intersectionality, all of that. But access and participation is, generally speaking, about where you'd expect it to be. It could always be better. Academic outcomes, as we've mentioned, are nearly the same. But what that hides is the actual disabled student experience. All too often, they've had to fight a system. They've had to impress upon the system information about themselves. They have to share information on numerous occasions. They may have had difficulty with accessing disabled student allowance and its evidence needs. They might have issues about extenuating circumstances and evidence that might be needed in there. Or colleagues might be unaware of the nature of the impact of the disability on the learning process. And also the issue we just raised around employment and employability, big issue about how we prepare people for employment. Especially now, you know, when you think about it, I remember students saying to us that, disabled students saying, well, I've done all the work and the guidance, and I've read all the career stuff about how to move into employment. But of course, now I'm going to be home-based and working from home. What are the issues that come with access to work for me in that scenario? And what will my employer expect and anticipate? So we listened a lot over 3 years, and we thought, well, what we need to do is to move the sector up a bit, give it a challenge, say, let's actually develop what we do and expand what we do. And let's take all the lessons we've got from the pandemic and not go back. Keep the things that are good. And some of the things that were good, you know, I remember a disabled student saying, we'd been asking for certain of these things for years and being told we couldn't have them. And now everybody's got them. You know, recording of lectures was a big debate in institutions. Infringement of people's human rights, infringement of academic freedom, my copyright, I'm not a performer. You know, all of those arguments, many of us will have heard. But now it's everyday life. Recognizing that you might not need evidence always for extenuating circumstances. Many institutions said, you know, don't worry about that because you're told not to go to the GP anyway because you can't access it. Let's actually get to a position where we just do that thing about trusting our students and believing them. So a number of things there. So we said, right, we're going to look at the commitment. Let's create a commitment. So the next slide, please, Mark. What we said is let's have this core sector that is saying, let's make a step change. Let's actually look and think holistically about what we want to do and to have a much more inclusive environment, one where people feel comfortable. So next slide, please. So what we're saying is that And we don't just address higher education providers. We challenge UCAS, we challenge the OFS, we challenge the Student Loan Company, we challenge the DFE, we'll challenge anybody that can influence and enhance the disabled student experience. So we're saying, yeah, providers, well, let's have that plan. How are you going to enhance the student experience through that life cycle? What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? And we've got some guidance on that. But of course, you also have situations where professional, statutory and regulatory bodies control what individuals can do. So what are they doing about making sure that disabled students understand any limitations on particular types of work that there might be? And if there are limitations, those limitations are justified and reasonable. And what reasonable adjustments might be available. Also, we've got to address employers. You know, how do you create a welcoming environment for disabled graduates? I've just done a preface for some work around inclusivity within the NHS as an employer. And there's a whole series of things around how people feel as employees in the NHS, and about whether they feel they can share information about their disability, or whether it carries with it a potential stigma and discrimination. And that's a real challenge that we've got to address. We can't walk away from the employers and what they should be doing. And we can't accept the government current culture on attacking inclusivity. Martin, next slide, please. So we've got some key principles. And those key principles are about how we believe the disabled student should be supported through this process. And we do it in sections. We talk about the principles around sharing information, how they share information, how many times they share information, the nature of that information. We also look at information, advice and guidance in gaining a place in higher education. What do you need to know? What should a provider tell you? What about moving on from studying? What about how you join the community? And what about on-course delivery? So we've looked at those aspects and come out within the commitment around very important aspects of what we are saying disabled students have said to us that they need. So, for the next slide, please. So, higher education providers. How, let's have the scenarios where institutions talk about how they're going to provide advice and guidance to all applicants. About how do they provide, what do they say about their disabled student support? Some are really good, some are really, really good. Some are very generic. And what is it we're trying to say? Where in the outreach strategies, UniConnect and other strategies, is the section on disability, and how is that in there, and who's involved in it? How accessible are open days in terms of, not just in terms of materials and mobility, but in terms of all the aspects that go on within it? Are there areas where it's difficult? I've talked about the PSLBs already, so we can have the next slide, please. Big issue about belonging. Yeah, it's really difficult for any student starting life in higher education. It's not the easiest thing to do. When you move between schools, you tend to go with peers. When you go into higher education, you often don't. So how do you create this sense of belonging? And that's about inclusive, welcoming activities, making sure that disabled students are a key part of that process and able to access everything. Making sure, and this is difficult, I understand the difficulty, but and I'll say this, I understand the ability, but actually, why isn't the support for all students in place on day one? Many will say, well, we didn't know the student needed it, and that's the responsibility of the student in terms of sharing information. Many will say, we didn't get the DSA evidence base through quickly enough. Well, the first few weeks, the first couple of weeks of any student's course is really important and really crucial. It allows them that sense of belonging. Putting some of our vulnerable students in a position where they don't have access to things that they need stores up potential failure, causes stress, causes more conflict, more hassle for that learner. So it really does need to be in place from day one. And in essence, that is a legal requirement under the Equalities Act. It's not just good practice, it's a legal requirement. The support plan, you know, whatever the support plan is, it needs to be known and understood by everybody who needs to know. Let's look at the curriculum design. How inclusive is it? Where is the choice in the form of assessment? You know, I've worked in institutions and challenged them quite often over why does every student in a particular condition get 10 minutes extra in an exam? I mean, what's special? You know, why 10 minutes? Why everybody with that condition? Where's the differential base? You know, why have they got to do an exam? Why can't they do something else? Why have they got to do an oral presentation? Why can't they do something else? As long as you're meeting the learning outcomes. And again, disabled students often told us that when they were going through the complaints procedures, the appeals procedures, the extenuating, they had to share information about their disability again, but the institution already knows it. And also there's a big thing about staff development, about making sure that our academics, when they go through their training courses, understand how to support disabled students. Next slide, please, Mum. And in terms of employability, yeah. Well, during the pandemics, of our survey, 75% of disabled students said they weren't aware of any employability guidance for them. Now, ADCAS would contest that, and I understand that, but it's quite clear that that is what the students were saying. So can we provide, how generic is the guidance? Can we do it by condition, by barrier? Can we be helpful in that sense? How can we work with employers to work, how can institutions work with employers, particularly around opportunities? How do we promote access to work and the disability passport? There's a session this morning, which is a launch of the disability passport project, which is piloted in 3 institutions. And it's going to be rolled out across the sector. We envisage it being rolled out on a voluntary basis in the next academic year for people to work with. Well, no, not next academic year, later this academic year. And you know, shouldn't employers be producing accessible information on how they support disability? It's all very well saying, you know, tick box here and there, but what are you going to do? Next slide, please, Martin. So how did this process come about? Well, sort of May, June 2022, because we didn't just write this in a cupboard and bring it out. We consulted a number of providers, a number of organizations, a number of different influential practitioners. And we then published it for formal consultation on the 31st of October. And with a closing date on that consultation of, I think it's the 6th of December. No, it might be the 9th of December. And then what's the next stage? Well, the next stage is that we'll listen, we're going to be listening to all the comments that people make. We will reflect on it, and we will produce the final version of the disabled student commitment. And alongside that, we will produce a student version of what they should look for in institutions meeting the disabled student commitment and what they should expect. So we'll be doing that, and you can see that in the new year. And it's really important that we can help, people can help us shape what that is. And the next slide tells us simply what the consultation process is. So I'll just leave that up there so people who haven't already seen that consultation process can just make a note of it, because we do really want that feedback. But I think the important thing that I'd like to say that I haven't said so far is that what we really have tried to avoid is this becoming a condition of registration with the OFS. Reason for that is that there's an awful lot of conditions, and what you tend to get with a condition of registration is a shift to the lowest common denominator to fulfill the level of condition, because you don't want to be in breach of that condition. Well, we think we should be, enhancing practice, improving practice. We think we should be striving for even better than we currently do in many, many places. So we don't think regulation is appropriate. People have said, why don't you have a kite market? Gold, silver, bronze. Well, that creates quite a lot of resource. It creates quite a lot of work. It becomes competitive rather than collegiate and collaborative. And what we're seeking to do is to say, no, we all want to learn from each other. And one of the things that we are toying with in the final round is to say, it's up to institutions how they say they address the commitment. But one of the things that's important is that we believe that every year or biannually, there should be a statement of the progress towards the commitment that an organisation has made, which is jointly signed off by the institution and the Disabled Students Forum within that institution. Not everything can be done overnight. We've got a very strong statement in the commitment that students ideally should only have to share the information once. That requires institutional systems to be able to talk to each other. That takes time. And there isn't an institution in the country that doesn't want its systems to talk to each other. It's just a difficult process and a difficult concept. So that's why we're saying it will take time, show your progress, but work through what progress you've made with your disabled students. And also make sure you've got a holistic approach, because we do see many, many stories about practice in Department A is brilliant, practice in Department B, where they've never had that condition before. They don't know how to address it, they don't know how to do it, and they don't listen to some of the advisors and the practitioners who can guide them on those sets. And making sure that the disabled student practitioner's voice is heard very clearly in how you develop that type of commitment. And the final slide is merely saying, really importantly though, thank you for listening, and really do want your feedback, how we can improve this, how we can make life better for disabled students. What we can't do is to say what institutions should do, because that's for institutions to develop within their framework, and institutions are different, and the context is different. So thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions and advice and help.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Jeff. Just kind of taking a bit of chair's privilege. I was at a meeting of our working group who looks at students with disabilities and the challenges they're facing. One of the things we were talking about is students being nervous about disclosure and also nervous about coming forward for help.
Yeah.
How we encourage them. And we're saying possibly one of the reasons for that is that throughout their educational journeys, they've normally had very strong advocates, primarily in the form of parents. And they've also seen what a battle that it's been for parents to get them the right support at schools.
Yeah.
And so I don't know whether it's a question, it's a comment, I'd welcome thoughts from the audience of, you know, how we show we are open, inclusive institutions who are looking to actually offer proper support, not to just make them tick a box on the form and then ignore it.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important comment, and we all know that's the position. And yeah, it's great that so many more people are sharing, and some of the issues, the stigmas are sort of going away a bit, but it's still there. We should never underestimate it, and the nervousness as well. And I think it's just so important that institutions have to, and this is part of what the community is saying, is get it out there, talk to people, get it up on the website. What is it you're doing? How are you doing it? And some places do it great, and some places less well. And the student version of the commitment, you know, what to expect from an institution, will be hosted on the UCAS website, because they believe quite strongly that people need this information, and we all need to work together to make sure that we are more inclusive. And that's difficult in the current political climate, because institutions can be a bit nervous about sticking their head above the parapet, but actually we owe that to our students to do that.
We've had a few questions come through in the chat, and just
great.
I've got some more slides with some more questions on, but we may as well take the ones that have come up for, it may not need fronting. Nadia's asked a question. Welcome, Nadia. Where can we find more information about the disability passport in terms of format?
I appreciate that. And it should be out fairly soon. As I said, there was an event this morning where it was introduced, and it was piloted at Wolverhampton, Manchester Metropolitan and King's, I think. And I will get information about it, and Martin, if I pass it to you so that people can find it. Where it's, what's going to happen, what I'm told is going to happen by the department, is that this will be rolled out voluntarily for providers to use later this academic year, because it's about a movement into employment. And they started that passport process about 6-7 months ago, and they've evaluated it, and that was there was a pre-publication launch today, and so it should be out pretty soon. Okay. And I'll get that to, I will make sure that it will be on the DSE website, and we'll make sure we get it to people.
Okay, brilliant. Penny Longman from UCL Careers. I'd like to ask a bit more about providing careers guidance by condition, bearing in mind students are all individuals and the way their condition impacts them will vary even within the same condition. Careers guidance professionals are very aware of not being experts on different disabilities and can't possibly be experts on every condition, but we believe we can be useful to disabled students even so, and want to be useful.
I totally agree. And I think, you know, one of the things that universities are brilliant at, absolutely first rate, is reinventing the wheel. And things not, you know, and regarding the concept of things have to be developed here to be of value. And that's particularly the case in the academic arena. Well, we need to be sharing more of that information. So if you take neurodiversity, for example, and you take various conditions within there, then it's about talking about the benefits, the really positive issues that go with certain conditions around memory retention, attention to detail, things like where you change the nature of what can be seen as a negative thing into a positive thing, and where you bring out the individuals and the skills that go with particular conditions. And clearly every individual is different, but you've got that in everything you do anyway. So it's about actually sharing some of this work, and some of the sector organisations to sort of say, this is what this type of condition means, and this is some of the benefits to employment and all the employment practices that go with it. We've just got to work together, because we haven't got the resource in any institution to do some of this that we need to be doing, and we need to share it. And AGCAS, for example, in that scenario would be a classic sector body to work on that, along with Advanced AG. So I think we do need to see it. And what I forgot to mention on a separate issue, Martin, is you'll see that the disabled research students' satisfaction in the Advanced AG publication today has declined. They feel far less satisfied than others with their program. And it's all about the experience on course and on research program. So I agree. I think it was Penny. I was agreeing with Penny about the issues. I think we just got to think about how we work through it and how we promote things.
Penny's kind of popped up on my screen. Does that answer your question, Penny?
Yes, partially. I mean, certainly that is the approach we take, is definitely how to present things as a positive, how to identify the skills that you're bringing that perhaps the employer wouldn't realize that you would bring. But I guess what I'm thinking is trying to package it by condition maybe sets up unrealistic expectations, whereas we would have those kind of guidance, counselling, conversations with students and help them to work out and bring out what it is for them that they can identify through help with us, but what they can identify as being their strengths. So I guess I was just having a hesitation about like maybe a requirement to kind of compartmentalize in that way. Thanks.
No, you've also got multiple conditions as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's not a simple thing, but we've got to remember that, and I accept what you're saying, Pam, that isn't always the case of what happens.
No.
And what we're trying to do is to raise the level. And some of the things we've said people already do, which is fantastic.
Thanks. I think those of you who don't know, I used to work in financial services, and we used to have something called a Know Your Customer form. Before you gave financial advice, you found out what their needs were, what their wants are. I think giving careers advice in many ways is a similar situation, isn't it? It's about needs, wants, where do you want to go, and fully understanding that. And whether you're disabled or not, that's a really important aspect of giving that advice. So thanks for your question, Penny. Katia has asked, aren't there GDPR problems with setting up information sharing, even within institutions? I'm finding in my role at university that it's a tricky landscape to navigate. I agree whole processes need overhauling, but how? It's a nice simple one for you there, Jeff.
Yeah, GDPR, I love it. It's about making sure you can work it through. It's about how you ask for consent and what the parameters of that consent are. And when you think about if a student wants to share their condition and wants support, why would they not want you to share it with people who can give that support? But all too often, and I've seen it so many times, GDPR is rolled out as a way of not doing something. The computer says no sort of concept. And I think we just got to sort of get the consent right. And we've got to make sure that we're using it in that positive way and the student knows who or what category of people you're sharing it with. And that is okay.
Okay. Brilliant. Jodie, welcome, Jodie. She said, I would say, having been a student, that I was lucky to be in a course that was very supportive of my disability, as they were aware and understood it. education, but one of my flatmates on a different course, history, no insults to historians in the audience, by the way, did not experience this, a lack of understanding, and had to fight for things because the academic did not want to change.
Yeah.
How do we make sure, even in one institution, everyone has the same access?
And that's what we're saying, because you are so right, Dodie, that is, and there's some brilliant practice, absolutely fantastic practice, but it's generally not holistic across the institution, consistent across the institution. And you see, when people have got joint degrees, and you can imagine how some of those issues arise. And this is about leadership within the institution. And one of the things that we've said is that there needs to be somebody in the senior leadership team who is challenged with making sure this is a holistic approach, and that it is valued, and that people know how to support. Yeah, the idea that you can have an academic in a classroom with a disabled student with a particular, and not understand that condition, and not be aware of that condition. You know, what sort of world are we living in? I'll never forget. I mean, I was a person when I was first lecturing, I used to walk around a lot. And then I had a lip reader in my class, and I knew, you know, I was briefed on how I had to stand still. You know, and you learn how you have to look at that person, and you learn that. And it was wonderful, and really changed a lot of my thinking and practice, because I learned a lot from it. We've all got a lot to learn, and I find it unacceptable that academics and others don't relate to particular conditions and aren't aware of the conditions of some of their students. And I think we just got to make sure that institutions drive that home.
Okay, Brian's put quite an interesting one here. I think there's still a huge issue in FE around the lack of preparation for disabled students going into HE. This seems to be due to a lack of knowledge and time on the part of FE staff. I'm not quite sure where Brian was coming from with that one, but I mean, I suppose one thing from the disabled working group that was coming through was actually people giving learners pre-HE who were looking at applying HE, giving them very false information. Is that what you mean, Brian? About, oh, well, you won't get the support, and oh, well, they don't have support service for disabled learners in higher education. So maybe that goes back to HE being a little bit more upfront about what we do offer. So
yeah, that's right. But you've also, I think I made the point about how open days work, accessible open days, making them available, what's there. Also about the outreach strategy of institutions, how they address things and what they're looking at. But don't forget that you can look, if you look at this, you can look by subject at what a number of disabled students study. A lot with learning differences, study within the arts. You've also got people know where particular aspects of support are to be found. So in Wolverhampton, we've always had a significant number of deaf and hearing impaired students, because then we employed full-time sign language interpreters, and because we've got a history of you know, creating British Sign Language as a modern language, and there's a whole culture that goes back about 20 odd years, and the deaf community knows that, and therefore they tend to go where the support is. There's a whole, it's a complex picture, but we do have to be very clear on how we support disabled students and what we say we're going to do, both in terms of accommodation, in terms of learning materials, in terms of accessibility to different facilities, about how we support through DSA if they're able to, if they're eligible for DSA, and you know, a lot of students aren't eligible for DSA because of the nature of the condition, or because they're international students, you know, but they're all students who we have to look after. quite rightly and quite properly.
Sophie's made a comment. I would like to see acknowledgement for higher education providers that some students' disabilities barriers will only come to light during the course of their degree programme. These students should be able to access support immediately as going through the process of diagnosis or require medical evidence.
Absolutely, and we make a point in there that you know, disability isn't necessarily, you know, people do share information at a later stage. They may become disabled, you know? And what we actually need, and what we'll have in discussions with the student loan company for such students that where they have become disabled, is a fast track approach through the DSA where relevant.
And she's added most disabled students haven't had the opportunity to really experiment with what support works for them. Most of the time you get what you're given, which is kind of interesting. I would like to see education providers creating opportunities to discover what works for the individual. This would require a lot more flexibility than exists in the current system and processes. Yes, indeed. And I'd hope the choice in the form of assessment went some, because most modules can give choice in the form of assessment. I would hope that would go some way to support that. But it's also about flexibility and looking at individual needs. Yeah. So I agree with that. Yeah, I think Jodie's come back to a point we made earlier on about talking to a student recently. She was not going to declare her disability, and she thought by doing this on UCAS it would affect her chance of getting a place. Yeah. And it's a long time talking through the process, support and general using my experience. And we have mentors for people through the process. And there's an element there of making sure that schools know that universities are very supportive of disabled students and will, and we're not, you know, we don't make decisions, we don't select people out because of a disability, and we actually want to be inclusive, and just getting that message across is hard. Yeah, definitely. And then Anne-Marie Houghton, welcome Anne-Marie. Be interesting to hear a bit more about the expectations for progression from undergraduate back into further study, postgraduate training or postgraduate research before they move into careers and employment. Has there been any discussion about that cycle of the process? We are finding this is coming up in some research we've been doing about the number of WP students, including disabled students. Yeah, I mean, thanks, Anne-Marie. Good to hear from you. We're waiting for a couple of research projects to come out, and this may well be what Anne-Marie's talking about, which is about particular research students and who's excluded from research and who's not engaged in research postgraduate level. And those reports, which OFS and Research England funded, come quite soon. So we're waiting to see what they say, because we want to sort of support their recommendations when we see them. But until we get there, it's difficult for us. But I see no reason why disabled students should, you know, once they've graduated and they're graduating, why can't they progress into the next phase of further study, etc.? There should be no barriers there, other than it might be the wrong subject for them, or, you know, attainment issues, etc. But we should make that easy, and by easy, I mean the process should be easy. And of course, there is no UCAS for that approach. We rely on UCAS a lot into undergraduate, and there isn't that process for postgraduate. It's left to institutions and departments to work through, and that may well be something that is within an institution's response to the commitment, because the commitment isn't about access to undergraduate students, it's about access to all types of provision. I think Anne-Marie's just come back in the chat, but I can't see the chat. She's put, I suppose it's a matter of thinking about the higher education provider plans to include this as part of their process. And the lack of UCAS is one of the issues. So something for the higher education provider to think about. It'd be interesting, I suppose, to see when the OFS publish their risk register, or whatever they're going to call it, how high up disability comes on that risk element.
Well, yeah, and obviously I'm arguing that it should be very high on that risk register. I'll continue that argument.
Yeah, particularly because for some reason, when you look at diagnoses of disability, the lower social classes are overrepresented in the people who are diagnosed with disability. So it's like a double whammy of disadvantage.
They are, but generally not in mental health.
Right.
That's the one category it's different.
Okay. I've got, please feel free to right, we've kind of gone on to discussion already. But I did put, it might be worth us just running through and seeing if anyone's got any comments about the specific questions that you've asked kind of within the consultation, you know, and if you haven't had a chance to read the consultation, obviously bear these things in mind when you go away. So with the request to share information, is there any wording and specific recommendations you think should be changed or added in relation to requests to share information? In section 2, the information, advice and guidance in accessing higher education, is there any wording and or specific recommendations you think should be changed or added in relation to the section on information, advice in accessing higher education? I think one of the things historically, and I know it's one of the things in NEON that we've spoken about a few times, is that it can be quite hard to identify a group. So you have this idea that all activities should be accessible to all, but sometimes people with disabilities, that the downside with that is they need some very specific information. And the example I would give, I always remember this, hearing a professor speak up at an Aim Higher event many moons ago up in Newcastle, and he was blind. And he said, there is no point on taking me on a campus tour and showing me the library. I might have specific questions about how do I access those resources, but what he was kind of suggesting, and the thing I took away from that, is sometimes if we're not careful, inclusion can become exclusion. You know, you can't have a one-size-fits-all activity. And I think there's been some resistance in the past to actually running specific events for learners with disabilities. Although I know up in Manchester, I know they've done some exceedingly good work before with some success, particularly around, I think, autistic spectrum disorders as well. So they've actually focused in on that. Sophie's just typed in there, higher education providers need to be aware of the cultural context around disability and how this will affect students' likelihood to come forward with support. I don't know if Sophie wants to expand on that at all. If you do, Sophie, you can unmute. If you don't, that's fine.
Thank you. As just my point around sort of cultural context is that, you know, students from different cultural, ethnic backgrounds, etc., might have had less access to support and diagnosis or recognition of their conditions before coming to university. We already know that there's lots of barriers to information for specific groups anyway, just generally around HE. So I think that when students are in the HE environment, that it's really important that staff are aware of that, and that not all students are necessarily going to arrive knowing their needs or even necessarily recognising them as support needs if they've not been validated or recognised before.
Yeah, I think mental health is a very challenging aspect, particularly because of the way once students come, we tend to have the attitude that they're adults, they're independent. And I think the dangers of that maybe have been shown, in recent events. It's a hard one. Jeff, do you want to comment?
I mean, I think the cultural aspects are really, really important, and it happens more and more as providers. People are thinking around the implications of that, and it's about making sure that it's not a one-size-fits-all, and that we're able to address those individual needs. And if you go back to report in the turn of the century, you can say those sort of things these days, can't you? Turn of the century. Inclusive education is about where you fit the needs of the learner, and that isn't about the same thing for everybody. It's different needs for different people, and that is part of the cultural context. So I think that's an important point.
Jodie's just put, does something need to be done to promote mental health? I know some institutions do try and do things to promote mental health, but some people do not always see it as a disability. So they don't receive the support they are entitled to.
Yeah, we've got a significant increase in the number of people sharing information around mental health. And much more work needs to be done. And the NHS has got the same issue of that increase in sharing, and it's going to get. I can only, maybe I'm wrong, but I can only see those issues, mental health issues, growing post-pandemic. And I really think it's a fundamental part of what providers have to look at these days, making sure they do address how they support mental health issues.
Yeah. Just kind of moving on, section 3, joining the higher education community. Is there any specific recommendations you think should be changed in relation to the section on joining a higher education community? On course delivery, is there any wording and or specific recommendations you think should be changed or added in relation to the section on course delivery? I think it was a really interesting point that came up before about the difference between subjects. And I think you can even get a difference between certain academics. I go back to Jeff's point about maybe the recording of lectures and how accessible those are, or the providing of notes beforehand with very different attitudes. So it would be nice to have a common approach across the institution. Section 5, moving out of studying in higher education. Is there any wording and or specific recommendations you think should be changed in the section moving out of studying into higher education? And Penny raised another point there, saying that there are also big challenges when thinking about employment for international students going back to their home countries, where employment law is different and attitudes can be very different towards disability. And I know through the work we've done on World Access to Higher Education Day, that's been very apparent to me, the differences in attitude. We can't assume advice we give based on UK equality law is helpful.
It's not just employers. I mean, Penny's right, but it's not just employers, it's also your transnational education providers as well. I'll never forget, there's one partner in a country that we were working with, or trying to work with, whose response to our standard format about how they support disabled students was, we don't have any disabled students. And I think that was probably a statement that they don't recognise disability. We didn't work with that provider as a result of that. But that's part of what higher education providers do that often falls below the radar on this one. But Penny's dead right about how you address the work patterns back in the country the individual is returning to. And my argument there would be they've come for a UK higher education experience, and we need to give them the things that we believe are important in a UK higher education experience. may sit uncomfortably back in their own country. But that's what they've come for, and that's what we are.
Anne-Marie's made a point saying about a point saying that it's a useful observation, but it also relates to when disabled students from international contexts arrive at the university, and that their country's culture can affect their disclosure during their higher education provider experience.
Yeah, that's true, and that's just recognising those cultural differences.
And then just at the end of the consultation, there's some general questions. Is there anything missing? Has Jeff missed anything and his team?
I will have missed loads of things, so I'd really like help with that one.
Are there any other stakeholders you think we should be calling out upon within the disabled student commitment? So is there anyone else who needs involving? Hayley, yes, we will. Hopefully, if I've operated this all correctly, it will be recording. So once I get the chance to download that recording, we will make sure it's sent out to everyone. Oh, there's another comment there from Martel. Request to share information. Work towards asking students to share information about their condition, making it individual and bespoke, face-to-face interaction, encouraging discussion beforehand regarding support plans or adjustments in place from commencement of studies.
I think one of the things I didn't say was that the government will be producing, it consulted on its SEND green paper recently, and one of the outcomes is likely to be a closer match between assessment of needs in schools and colleges with that of higher education, and trying to develop a seamless route so that people don't have to start declaring, sharing information from scratch and evidence from scratch when they come into higher education. More about accepting the diagnosis and support that's already taken place. Not always appropriate because of the nature of different forms of learning, but if it gets us through for a number of people quicker and the support's in place, then that's a positive step. Yeah,
I think one of the drawbacks, I totally agree with you, Jeff, but I think one of the drawbacks, and I probably get the acronym wrong now, is that students who've got, is it EHIPs? It's one of those statements as I used to know them. Kind of are in the minority and tend to be issued less and less. And so that kind of in-depth description of a student's needs where they exist, I think absolutely if we could share them in some way. But I mean, parents and applicants have a copy of those as well. So again, I think it goes back to how do we encourage people to share that at the point of application.
No, you're right. You're right.
And the other thing, Jeff may have some more questions he wants to ask you after this one, but the other one in the official consultation was, do you have any feedback on the disabled student commitments as a whole? Just from my perspective, Jeff, I think it's a real positive step forward, and hopefully will improve the system, and HEIs will sign up and get behind this. But do you have any more questions for the audience, Jeff? Is there anything else you?
No, not really. It's just, there's been some really good comments, and I thank you for that. Some of it we just can't address at the moment, but we'll listen to all of this, and we'll try to share that information. And I'm just really appreciative of your comments and your time.
Okay, lovely. There's still a few questions coming through.
Good.
Helen's got to leave. Sorry, Helen. Are there going to be good practice examples in the disabled students commitment, or is that something you've tried to do as the commission to gather examples of good practice?
We talk about it, and you've always got this issue about what is good practice, etc. And I think there's a lot of organisations. There's a number of people who came across and asking careers questions and comments. Then I'd much rather personally see organisations owning that practice and talking about that practice. And you've got the National Association of Disability Practitioners, you've got ANCAS, you've got MOSHI. If we get them talking about it and sharing that practice, I think we will see a bigger change than, because it becomes embedded rather than an organisation that's just simply focused on disabled students doing it. I would also say that if you read Mary Kernock-Cook's report on student futures, really powerful statement Mary makes, and she made it in the as we were talking to her, is that you normally find the section in such reports on disabled students sort of chapter 9. She put it in chapter 1. Put it right at the heart of what you're seeking to do. It's like job descriptions, having commitment to equality of opportunity is item number 74 in that particular set of roles, etc. Let's be far more upfront about these things.
Yeah. Martel's asked another question about the disability passport, but I think as you said, that's only just being launched, isn't it? So we're going to try and get more information out to you about that, Martel. But she mentions, will schools, college and careers advisors be aware of them? I mean, with the passport, is that entering employment at whatever stage of your education?
It's moving into, it's moving from higher education. It's a pilot. It was a pilot. And it was moving from higher education into employment. The next phases of it will be from moving from school into higher education. Right.
Okay. Which is so probably that's a future step, Martel, where they will. Sophie, I think higher education providers are well placed to work with students around confidence and self-advocacy. I was lucky enough to go to a specialist school for sixth form, and this was one of the biggest and longest serving benefits for me, over and above the actual access to learning on course. Anne-Marie, clearly there are principles of good practice, but it's important that things are contextualised. And so colleague sharing seems to be the answer. So share. John Blake would like that one, Anne-Marie. He wants us to share more. So let's keep. I think we're quite good at sharing within widening access. I don't think it's a new thing to us, and we're hoping to hold an event in the late winter, early spring, so February, March time, when the disabled student commitment comes out. Actually, have a day-long event looking at disability, looking at how you can take the commitments and apply it to your own institution as well. Watch this space, and we'll be in touch quite soon about that. But I'd just like to thank Jeff for his time this afternoon to talk to us. Oh, look, they're still coming in. Jodie, you're coming in with more questions now. How do academics manage when they have students with disability that might have conflicting accessibility requirements? Is that right, Jodie? Because I think you misspelt it. Also, do we reduce stigma and thinking around academic thinking? Students don't need. Jodie, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Because I'm just. It's probably just the way it's been typed.
Yeah, sorry, I'm very dyslexic. So yeah, how do academics manage conflicting accessibility requirements? So I had an academic come up to me and was like, how can I teach a lecture when there's so many students have different requirements that conflict? In my mind, it's you should make it work. Schools do, universities, colleges do, so why can't academics? But I thought I'd put it out there. And then kind of reduce some of the stigma that some academics have. that a lecture needs to be a lecture and everyone should just sit and listen. And I guess some of the more older academics that maybe aren't thinking about change, like how do we get them on board, I guess.
I think back, Jeff will remember this probably better than I do, but some of the work Liz Thomas did around accessible pedagogy. And one of her points was that it actually benefits everyone. It's not just disabled students, it benefits all students. And so when you say competing, I think you have to dig down in and say, well, what's actually competing here? What's the thing you're having to do that's, you know, at odds with somebody else's disability within the room?
Yeah, I mean, you did right, because when I had a disabled student in class, and talking quite a while ago, part of the support plan for the student was about producing the PowerPoint slides in advance. So I thought, well, why not give them to all students in advance? Why not just do that? You could argue that there's competing accessibility there, but well, they've all got them in advance now. So what's the problem? Now, I take Jodie's point about schools teach people at all sorts of different levels in the same class, etc. It's not rocket science. It's just actually modifying what you do and how you approach them, being people-centered.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jeff. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
No,
Thank
you're
you
welcome.
for when it turned up. I'm aware there's quite a few people who dropped out of the meeting, probably to rush off to something else. But thank you for attending. Yeah, keep your eyes on this space. If you haven't yet completed the consultation, please do. We did put a link out to it in Neon News a couple of times. So if you look back at your emails, you'll be able to find the link there, or you can go on the Disabled Student Commission website and the link to it is there as well. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jeff, and hopefully we shall see you all soon.
Can I just thank everybody for listening and commenting and anything they're about to say? Fantastic. Thank you very much.